and am here as part of a delegation that is working on a very important national security and homeland security, indeed civilizational security problem, in connection with the National Council of State Legislators conference that's taking place here in Atlanta over the next several days. We're here to talk about an issue that is on the agenda at that NCSL meeting, in part thanks to the work of one of our distinguished colleagues, Maine State Representative Andrea Boland. We'll be speaking with her in a moment about the work that she's been doing in the state of Maine to try to protect the grid, the electric power distribution system of Maine against the threat of electromagnetic pulse manifesting itself either from naturally caused or man-caused circumstances. This is a remarkable group of people. We have several of them present. Several of them are also still over at the site, trying wherever possible to bring up the level of awareness and knowledge about the threat that we're facing from these various kinds of electromagnetic energy and the unpreparedness of our power grid to contend with them, and if the grid is not protected against such phenomena, again, either from space weather, as George Baker will be talking about momentarily, Michael Del Rosso will be speaking about momentarily, or from nuclear-caused attack, as George Baker will be talking about, the grid is in peril, and with it, essentially all of the infrastructures, critical infrastructures upon which our society depends. So we're here to talk a little bit about both the threat, the extent to which it must be addressed, and then initiatives that are being taken first by a new EMP Coalition, of which we are all participants, and in particular, Beverly Zaslow will be speaking a little bit about some of the efforts that that coalition is making today and will be making in the future to try to raise awareness about the challenge, as well as to promote the sorts of practical, near-term, and affordable steps that can be taken to remedy our present extremely dangerous vulnerability. And finally, we will be hearing from Andrea Boland. State Representative Boland has taken the lead in trying to bring some of these ideas to fruition in her own state of Maine. So with that, I'm going to ask George Baker first and foremost to talk to us about the challenge that he's been wrestling with for decades as one of the nation's preeminent technologists and scientists specializing in electromagnetic pulse phenomenon for many years with the Defense Nuclear Agency and then the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. He has been involved in a congressional EMP commission that was tasked with examining this challenge and recommending specific corrective actions. And he will share with us some of the insights of the commission with respect to what can be done and how urgent it is that we do it. George Baker, welcome.
Thank you. When you detonate a nuclear weapon at high altitudes, I'm talking altitudes above about 25 miles, 40 kilometers, there is a coherent electromagnetic pulse that is generated, and the physics is a little involved, but essentially the entire atmosphere becomes a coherent radiator, a large phased array antenna, if you will, and you can get fields in on the order of tens of thousands of volts per meter on the ground. And it doesn't matter the yield. There's an atmospheric saturation effect. It doesn't matter whether it's a low yield entry level type weapon or a high yield strategic weapon. You get essentially the same peak field on the ground. So also in addition to this coherent field, this tens of thousands of volts per meter on the ground, The expanding fireball and the nuclear weapon debris creates a very low frequency field we refer to as magnetohydrodynamic EMP, or also abbreviated E3. And that field is much lower in amplitude, but it will couple very efficiently to the power grid. Now, both the coherent, fast, high amplitude field and the low frequency E3 field couple to the atmosphere. The E3 is very similar to what you get from a solar storm. So it turns out that if you protect the grid against EMP, you will in de facto have protected the grid against the solar, the solar, we call them geomagnetic disturbances or geomagnetic pulses. We know how to deal with this. The Department of Defense has been dealing with these threats for the last 50 years, beginning with the Minuteman system. They have developed routine engineering techniques that are now standardized, and so we know how to do it. We also know from DoD experience that the protection is quite affordable, that the protection might run 1 to 3% if you're trying to protect a building of a building cost. We also know from the EMP Commission work that to protect the bulk power system against EMP might run in the single-digit billions of dollars. And if you amortize that over 20 years, a typical customer might be paying an additional 50 cents per year for protection of the grid. So we know this can be done. The thing that's so commendable, I want to congratulate Andrea Boland for sponsoring and passing through her state legislature, the Maine legislature, a bill that will get Maine started in protecting their grid. Because we have had some problems with who's in charge at the federal level, it looks like the responsibility may fall to the states. This is good for another reason. We had a national exercise at the National Defense University and Johns Hopkins University that one of the main conclusions was that we need to decentralize the protection of the grid. And that the state efforts then will essentially fulfill that. The grid is interconnected to the point where a single tree touching a branch can bring down large portions of the grid, as happened in August 2003. So the simple lesson is, if we can decentralize, each state protect itself, that we can avoid these these continental scale disasters. I think I'll stop there.
Good. George, thank you. The point about the affordability, I think, is what we'll probably come back to again and again. It's certainly the case as we're at the point of contemplating a new smart grid, that building into it resiliency makes it vastly more affordable than trying to engineer it after the grid has been built out. A man who knows a great deal about both the grid and what it's going to take to try to remedy its present vulnerability against the sorts of threats that are clearly in the offing from space weather, as well as possibly adversaries like those George has described, is our next speaker. He is Michael Del Rosso. He has quite an extraordinary career in advanced technology and bringing it to fruition in the private sector. He's also a senior member of the Institute of Electric and Electronics Engineers, the IEEE, and served as its past chairman of the IEEE USA Critical Infrastructure Protection Committee. I'm very pleased to say he's a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and one of the go-to guys at the national level on the problem that we're confronting today and what needs to be done about it. Michael Del Rosso.
Thank you, Frank. Just looking at the threat of a bad geomagnetic storm is of interest because the sun constantly emits parts of its corona. You have these coronal mass ejections, which is basically matter with the electrons spit off, and it can come out at millions of miles an hour. And in a period measured probably every 150 to 300 years, it spits out a massive amount that could actually statistically hit the Earth. We have little effects of that every day of varying degrees. The first time we recognized this effect of a coronal mass ejection that hit the Earth was in 1859, around September 1st. There was a British helioastronomer named Carrington, and this is named after him, the Carrington event. And he was his task, he was observing sunspots, with these dark spots on the sun. He'd have a camera obscura, a pinhole camera, and he would map and trace on tracing paper the spots. And he's doing it one day around noon, and he sees all of a sudden an eruption on the paper that covers a third of the circle of the sun, and it's so bright it makes the rest of it look dark. And he calls some people in, and they look at the phenomenon, and it disappears after a couple of minutes. Well, unbeknownst to him, a massive amount of corona, measured in many times the mass of the Earth, was ejected at millions of miles an hour, and in under 18 hours it covered the distance between the sun and the Earth, which is almost 93 million miles, and it hit the Earth. And when you have charged particles like that hitting at a high speed, a magnetic field which the Earth is surrounded in, you generate a current, a flow of electrons at a very low frequency. And those electrons come down, and because they're at a low frequency, they get picked up in something that might be a suitable length antenna, which is something that's in meters in length of a conductor. And at the time, the things that existed in the Earth in 1859 were telegraph wires and barbed wire fences. So if you were a telegraph operator in contact with the system, you were tremendously shocked. It set telegraph offices on fire. You could, for days, the phenomenon so charged the telegraph wires that you could actually key without a battery, and you'd actually get a telegraph signal sent along the lines. And the aurora borealis moved down toward the equator. It was down to the Caribbean. There's news reports of miners in Colorado that thought it was morning because the sun was up, and they woke up at around midnight, and they could read without illumination from the glows of the aurora borealis that had been pushed down and been greatly brightened. A lesser event, maybe only 1/10 the magnitude, happened in 1921, back when there was still a very crude electronic infrastructure, and it brought down the Penn Central switching system, which was at the time worked off of relays and vacuum tubes. If the same phenomenon happened today, and by the way, when the government's faced with a serious issue like this, they'll put together a commission. The space shuttle goes down. Let's get the best experts in to figure out why. There's been no less than 5 blue ribbon commissions by the federal government. The Congressional Committee to assess the threat of electromagnetic pulse attacks. There's a Congressional Committee on the Strategic Posture of the United States. The National Academy of Sciences did a report just a couple of years ago on severe space weather events. The DOE did one, and Oak Ridge National Laboratories did one on electromagnetic pulse effects on the U.S. power grid. And even in Great Britain, the UK House of Commons Defense Committee did a study on developing threats from electromagnetic pulse. They're all in concurrence that this is a significant not only threat and hazard, but that were to occur, you're looking at sovereignty-ending events. The 2011 National Academy of Sciences study, which looked at the 1921 data, which is some of the more complete data that we have, and again, only 1/10 of the magnitude of a Carrington event, it said if that were to happen today, you would look at many tens of millions of people or hundreds of millions of people without power. It would cost up to $2 trillion with a T dollars in the first year to start to repair the system, and it could take 4 to 10 years to restore the national grid. Now, the good news is to protect against a bad geomagnetic storm costs merely hundreds of millions of dollars. To protect the national grid against even the more onerous effects and insidious effects of a nuclear EMP is probably $2 billion and less. But again, the impact is in the trillions if you don't. It's as though you owned $1 million home and someone said, hey, give me 50 or $100 and I'll indemnify you against fire and all hazards, and you go, no, I'm not going to take that bet. It's really irresponsible for us to not address this issue, and to address it correctly really requires national level planning. So we're hoping that at the state levels, and as Dr. Baker pointed out, it reeks of common sense to have a distributed resiliency. That way you have more nodes that have to be damaged before you have overall bad effects, but it really takes, because of the interconnection not only of the electric grid, but also other elements of the critical infrastructure, telecommunication, et cetera, you really need to coordinate, and leadership needs to be present. And Andrea showed that leadership where she successfully got passed into law in Maine legislation that is a starting point for them to actually address the problem in the grid that they have regulatory control over. And just about 2 months ago, Representative Yvette Clarke, a Democrat from Brooklyn, New York, and Representative Trent Franks, a Republican from Arizona, co-sponsored legislation and co-introduced it, House Resolution 2417, the SHIELD Act, which at the federal level would attempt to coordinate across the nation what Maine is initiated already.
Michael, thank you very much. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the campaign that the EMP Coalition is now mounting to try to take this kind of information and make it accessible to not just the lawmakers at both the federal and state level, but the American people as well, with a view to trying to ensure that what is clearly an urgent problem is addressed as a matter of urgency, not as a matter of business as usual at best, and at worst as somebody else's problem that won't be taken care of at all. To speak about that is Beverly Zaslow. Beverly has had a remarkable career in the entertainment business, much of it having to do with educational products that have been produced for PBS, Discovery, Fox, the History Channel, CNBC, and so on. A woman who knows her way around the social networking media as well as the more traditional media, and whom we're very pleased to have with us to talk a little bit about the capabilities that she's trying to bring to help with this educational campaign.
Yes. Well, as you're hearing, it's not a matter of if this happens, it's a matter of when it happens. And so what we need to do is raise awareness amongst people that this is something that's coming and that the time is now. We cannot wait to do something about this. It has to be done now. So we're creating a multi-tiered media platform that is going to allow for people to put up their own videos, their own things, but we've also created a number of videos to put a human face on this, looking at other disasters that have taken place and what happens to people and their lives and everything around them when they no longer have electricity. It's quite dire, the stories are amazing, and you would never even imagine that this could possibly happen. So the point of what we're doing with with the media platform is to create a very robust site where we educate people, raise awareness, allow them to reach out to their legislators and bring action, to ask them to do something and not ignore this, that it is urgent and it is immediate and they must do this. So that's there for them to reach out and raise awareness and push their legislators to do something. And then also it will have the social media platform that allows people to talk to each other, tell what they did, what happened to them, and allow everybody to come together and really create this and as a force for everyone to do something about.
Great. This is a coming attraction that will be at stopemp.org, the website of the coalition. We have, as it happens, one contribution, and I hope, Chris, we've got the right one queued up, by the honorary chairman. The honorary. Go.
I'm going to have to.
You're going to have to go do that. The honorary co-chairmen of this coalition are Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives from, of course, the Atlanta area during his time in the United States Congress, and also Jim Woolsey, former Director of Central Intelligence under President Clinton. Republican and Democrat demonstrating this really is not by any stretch of the imagination, a partisan issue. If in fact the electricity goes out and the catastrophic effects that have been forecast by these myriad commissions and other experts, including those associated with our coalition, prove right, people will die, perhaps 9 out of 10 of us, without regard for party affiliation or political preference. It is incumbent upon us, in short, to protect against this as a matter of the greatest of urgency. part of the frustration with the performance at the federal level that we've been talking about prompted our final speaker to take matters into her own hands, and through her leadership to enlist the support of Republicans and Democrats in the Maine state legislature, and ultimately to secure enactment of legislation designed to island her grid and thereby establish both some protection for the people of Maine and a model that we hope other state legislators meeting here in Atlanta today and tomorrow will be very much resonant with. Andrea Boland is now serving in her 4th term in the Maine State Legislature. She has developed really national status as a leader on electric infrastructure security, and has been most inspirational in terms of our efforts with this coalition and the particular purpose of being here in Atlanta to try to spread the word and find if there are a few more Andrea Bolands out there to help save this country from the threat of EMP. Andrea, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for your complimentary remarks. I just found that when I learned about this situation, that it certainly made sense that if Congress was in a position where they're kind of paralyzed these last few years, several years, then it doesn't make sense for us to hang around waiting for them to do something if we can do something ourselves. And I was able to become informed enough on my own and to develop a coterie of these wonderful scientists and experts that are available at the national level and very willing to share their information and ideas. I was able to bring to Maine a bill and produce these experts at the public hearing who were so compelling that the committee didn't even discuss time limits on their talking, just said, okay, you can do what you want. And we probably had about 6 experts there, and of course there were others who were involved in one way or another, first responder, that sort of thing. But the committee sat absolutely spellbound and listened to them uninterrupted for about 4.5 hours. And we had started in the afternoon, so at that point it was 6:30, 6:45, and it seemed appropriate to wrap things up. But many hung around to discuss it with the experts further and commented how they wished we had gone farther that day. We had more time. So what we produced, I was asking for an action piece, simply for the utilities to get protections on the grid. Nice, simple piece of legislation and to design these protections into anything that they were going to be doing into the future in order to be licensed to do that. What was appalling to me was that we had going on at that time a $1.2 billion expansion of our grid, which was supposed to be state-of-the-art, absolutely everything that you need, without these protections. And so my goal was to see that at least we start with that being fixed and we plan into the future. I wanted more, but I didn't ask for more because of the reality of legislation and thinking that in asking for too much I would not get anything. But after the committee heard the testimony, they said, well, shouldn't we be protecting everything that's there right now? And they took it farther. But it was clear from the testimony that was heard, and the industry was there giving testimony also, not initially in support of the legislation, but ultimately they were in the end, as it turned out, because the legislation got amended to really produce a study from what the experts were saying, what they could get from government support at FERC. There's a special office there just to support the states, and from the industry, just to take all the information in and come up with a report that defined what the vulnerabilities were in Maine, what the possible mitigations and protections were, what the costs were, low cost, medium cost, the higher cost, and short, medium, long term, who would bear the burden. And just sort of monitor what was going on, continue to monitor what was going on at the federal level, and report back to that committee and by January 20th of 2014 for them, if they desire, to put in legislation for protections for our grid based on that report. And I can just tell you, they have fabulous information, and they've got lots of input from the industry, but they alone will be responsible for producing the report, and they are very capable in that regard. So that's what we did in Maine, and I'm hoping that it leads to robust legislation for protections for the grid, because what we know is this a solar flare or a storm, or what, there's so many terms for it, geomagnetic storms. There are a lot of terms, but we all know that the sun is active and it throws out some big storms and flares, and the big one will come. It's inevitable. And as the sun sits out there, giving off these huge flares, we continue to rotate around it. And that's why, in part, it's inevitable that we're going to get hit one of these times. And we've seen it happen in the past as well. So my goal is just to start bringing Maine forward. And that piece of legislation passed as a piece of emergency legislation, which means it goes into effect immediately. The Public Utilities Commission was supportive of enough to start work immediately on it, even before it was passed in the legislature. It passed unanimously in the House and by 32-3 in the Senate. So it's something that people get. When they have the information, they know what the impact would be to have one of these events occur. And of course, there's also the part that the military does worry about, probably even more, of a hostile nation or a terrorist attacking. And they do know they have responsibility, but they are 99% dependent on the civilian grid. So they cannot respond in any sort of a credible way if they don't have power. The whole thing's nuts, because the industry has got the responsibility for setting the standards, and at this time they're actually trying to reduce the standards that are in place. The federal government cannot compel any particular kind of standard. They can ask them to work on it, promote it, push them, but what the SHIELD Act would do in part is to see that they can put some teeth in that and say, okay, let's get it done and get it done now. So those are the remarks I wanted to share with you. The arguments that we heard from the industry were, don't worry, we've got things under control, we can respond operationally, and they showed us their operational manual when we requested it. And it just said, in this event, go to the manual under this chapter, do this, go to that, go to this. It was really like me trying to understand how to use my computer initially. And you just can't imagine that would really work out. And in one case, because the person who makes the decision that the impact is going to be huge and takes the responsibility for taking down the grid is going to be causing blackouts themselves and costing millions and millions of dollars. So it didn't come clear to us that the industry did have a good plan. I actually think of this news story recently of Blue Rhino, where when they found out things were going to start to explode, all the employees ran. They took off and went home. And you can imagine it could be that could happen if you were just depending on people to follow procedures, wait for this, get permission to do one thing and another. that they could just throw up their arms and say, I'm out of here. You know, we know something bad is going to happen. I'm going to get home. So that's part of the problem with the operational part. But when asked from the man in charge of operations at ISO New England, if they could respond, if they had notice, that could only be maybe 20 minutes, he said he wasn't sure that they could, that they might need at least a half hour, an hour. The event that happened in Quebec in 1989 brought the grid down in 92 seconds. So it's unrealistic to not look at these protections at whatever level we can, whether it's state, local, federal, and of course it's a global concern also. The other argument that they made in Maine was that one state, according to NERC, should not do something on its own, because if they protect themselves, maybe the next state wouldn't be as protected. They maybe get a bigger brunt. But the fact of the matter is, this kind of a strike, it doesn't go by national or state boundaries. So they're going to be hit anyway. And if one state is able to help get them up afterwards, even one state here and there throughout the country, is my understanding, would be helpful. So I've gone a little long here, I guess, but thank you for the time.
That was terrific, as always. Thank you for your leadership and for the direction that you've really given us. They famously have said, as Maine goes, so goes the nation,
Well,
right?
let's hope so.
Let me just throw out to the panel one question, which it's come up in the panel that Andrea presided over at the National Council of State Legislators this morning, and it's really quite striking. One of our other colleagues, Dr. Peter Pry, mentioned, I believe, this black swan problem as the U.S. Intelligence Committee, Community, Intelligence Community has ascertained it. And Michael Del Rosa, maybe you might address that. That was not one of the studies that you mentioned, but it is yet another confirmation of the magnitude of this problem that the intelligence community determined by 2013 would be upon us, and potentially with, as we've been discussing, catastrophic effects.
Right. The intelligence community frequently does internal studies that usually are classified. This one they unclassified. The exact title name escapes me, but it listed 8 black swan events, and the background of that term is it's something that you thought would never happen and it really did. You know, the people never thought there was a black swan, and yet they found them when they settled into Australia a couple of centuries ago. So they came up with 8 events that would basically be catastrophic, that would be unforeseen if they were to happen. And one of them was a significant geomagnetic storm, which is, as a recent Lloyd's of London study that came out just about 6 weeks ago said, it is almost inevitable. And this study thought that easily 40 million Americans for up to 2 years could be without power if we had even a 1/10 intensity storm as the Carrington event of 1859.
And again, we would find very few of us surviving such a phenomenon, given the nature of our society without power. Questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have 2, if it's okay. Andrea, I want to say thank you for what you've done, and I think really the state is where this action needs to take place. So we have a couple thousand state legislators here today in Atlanta. What advice would you give to a legislator who's just now starting to understand this issue? And how would you direct them?
Well, I guess what I direct them to do is to take a look at what the legislation was in Maine. They can look it up at maine.gov/LEGIS, and then when that page comes up, just put in 131, where it shows LD 131, and they can see the history of it, and they can see the testimony of a number of the experts who came there. That, and any of those people are very agreeable to responding. But outfits like EIS Council, Frank Gaffney's group, which is the Center for
Security Policy.
There are a number of names like that. They can call me if they want to. They could call Congressman Trent Franks and Congresswoman Yvette Clarke. One thing I would just recommend is they not accept the notion that NERC, the utility industries, have all the answers. And they're the only authority. Because they're people, as you had described, our NASA, the Department of Defense, everybody, lots of wonderful people. Oak Ridge National Laboratories have done their work. So you have to consider everybody, but don't just stop at going to your local utility.
Could I just make one point? It's not that there aren't good people at NERC as well, or in these utilities. It's just that, let's be frank, they're in the private sector. They have to operate within an environment in which there is a bottom line. And costs associated with some of these corrective measures may seem quite considerable. And particularly if, as they've constructed this problem, it is really somebody else's responsibility to deal with at least parts of this, the military or national security pieces of it particularly. You can see them sort of coming up with one excuse after another. The question is, can we afford to continue to do that? And I think it's our view that we can. You had a second question?
Well, where do we stand in Congress with the SHIELD Act now? And what are the obstacles in terms of getting that?
Well, right. All right. So it has a number, but nowhere close to the number of co-sponsors that we're required to get through. There probably should be compatible legislation in the Senate coming through. And then there's, quite honestly, lobbying efforts. The NERC, the National Electric Regulatory Corporation, is in fact a lobbying body for the power industry, and for reasons unknown to me, they have taken a stance to obfuscate the magnitude of this problem and to really use their influence in Congress to not move things along. Now, I hope to have constructive work with them, but for years they've not taken a very straightforward approach to this. So we'll see where that goes. If they have legitimate concerns, we have no problem carrying the water for their legitimate concerns. If they, whether it's overregulation or undue costs. And by the way, this is a $16 trillion economy in the United States. We're a very wealthy nation, and it's inexcusable to not spend the insignificant, by comparison, sums necessary to actually secure not only our nation from foreign threats and the hazards of geomagnetic storm, but to really give a resilient infrastructure that for generations will give prosperity to this nation. And it's just inexcusable not to address this problem.
Do you want to say something on that, George?
Yes, one of the interesting things which has not really come to the forefront, protecting the grid actually over the long run can save the electric industry money, because they have to turn the volume down on the power being delivered during moderate solar storms. If you protect the grid, they can keep the grid running at full throttle continuously, and they will actually make these protective technologies will pay for themselves. So that's something that needs to be obviously studied some more. But there's a strong argument that protection actually benefits the industry, the electric industry.
Let me just make one other point. We're here in Atlanta, which is, of course, the headquarters city of the NERC, and we've asked for an opportunity to visit with leaders of that organization. We've had some conversations with some of the folks associated with the electric industry on the margins of the meetings this morning already, and we expect to do more of that in the next couple of days. But this is very much an opportunity for making common cause, because I think they're clearly part of the solution if they choose to be, and I'm afraid if, as Newt says, they won't play that role, we need to find a way to get them out of the way. But it's certainly preferable to have this be brought together as a concerted national effort, which the electric industries and their regulatory arms or their lobbying arms or whatever play a very constructive role. Yes, sir.
It's kind of new to the whole theory of EMP, and I was curious, we talked a lot about the threats, but can you just give me a little bit of information related to some of the protection, what that looks like, what it would entail? Is that something that utilities will be responsible for upgrading the system? How does that kind of look, moving forward as once folks get behind this piece.
Good question, George. You want to take that?
As I mentioned, the Department of Defense has been protecting systems since the 1960s with the Minuteman missile and knows how to do it. But the protection involves surge arresters, grid neutral blocking devices, and shielding. And with those three tools, you can protect anything. The techniques have been standardized. There is a cookbook. Here's how you apply these three tools that the Department of Defense has developed. There's a Mill Standard 188 that is unclassified that you can actually bring up on the net. It tells you how to do it, and there's no mystery how to do it. And the protection is affordable. The DoD has been protecting systems for it amounts to 1 or 2% of the system cost, and the same techniques that could be applied to the power grid. Go ahead.
Can I just ask one question, because it came up in the conversations that we had with some of the industry people this morning. There's a concern being expressed, and I must say it was by a lawyer, not by a technologist, that there would be unintended consequences for the grid if they were rushing into adopting some of the systems that you've described, George, based on decades of experience with this sort of shielding. What concerns would you have of bringing any of this kind of technology to bear to protect the grid? Is there any basis for those kinds of worries?
There's an effect where if you block the GMD currents at one location, that you will be transmitting what you've blocked down the line to another location. There have been some tests at Idaho National Lab that I was involved in. And I was there during the tests.
These are recent?
Recent. These were about a year ago. I think they were in August or September of 2012. That showed that may not happen, that the resistance of the lines may actually attenuate any transmitted current and would protect the rest of the grid, so that you could insert these blocking devices with no concern about, I guess some people call it the whack-a-mole effect of effects down the line.
But one of the other points that I understood came out of that analysis was that one of these blockers, was it, or surge protectors, actually wound up protecting multiple transformers.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the transformers, because I don't think we've spent much time on that and the difficulty. Andrea, you made a very interesting point at the conference about the relative costs of protecting them versus the costs of replacing them, if you could, and what you were trying to do at Maine. So maybe, George, talk a little bit about that at the macro level, and then...
The most highest risk elements of the grid are these high voltage transformers. These transformers are 2 stories tall. They can weigh as much as 500 tons. They cost millions of dollars to replace, and the world capacity to remanufacture these transformers is just a few per year. So if you had multiple, and we're talking thousands of these transformers failing, with the present manufacturing capability, it would take years to remanufacture and replace these. They're also, because of their size and their weight, they're very difficult to transport. They are not manufactured in the United States. We have to import them. They are recapitalizing some plants now where you might be able to buy one in a couple of years, or make one here in the United States in a couple of years, but not at present. So these transformers are really the tent pole in the effect that we need to be make sure we've got those protected.
Yeah, and the cost, just on that point about the impressive performance.
Yes.
The cost seems to be coming down in these protected techniques.
At the Idaho tests, we were actually connected into the national grid there, and we had 2 transformers set up side by side, and they found that they could protect both transformers. They actually demonstrated that with one blocking device, and they've done further analysis where the blocking device that they tested would actually be able to protect 4 of these very large high voltage transformers.
So the estimate that you gave of 50 cents per ratepayer per year for 20 years or so might actually be high.
Come down for the bulk power system. Yeah, right.
Good. Andrea, Maine, and your transformer situation and what prompted you to action?
Well, in discussing the cost, I was looking at the fact that we had a $1.2 billion expansion of the grid, and it would take only $4 million to protect not just that, but all the rest of, well, all the major transformers, as Dr. Baker was discussing. It would cost us about $4 million to do that. And it's estimated to replace any one of them would cost about $10 million. So, you know, that's
Do the
great
math.
school math. That's great school math.
Yeah.
So
And that's if you can get your hands on the transformers to replace them, and this is another problem.
There's that. So it seemed to me the obvious thing would be to protect them at least
Right.
until certainly we were manufacturing them here, and what a benefit that would be to any state who is looking to bring in new business that really needs to have grid security.
Amen. Any other questions from the audience? If not, let me just ask one thing that came up again this morning. And Michael, maybe you could take the lead on this. We were discussing the fact that there's really an all-hazard aspect to this problem. There's the bomb-produced effects. There's the geomagnetic storms generated by the sun. There are also 2 other ways, at least, that these critical nodes of the power grid could also be damaged, if not really destroyed. One of which is a radio frequency weapon, which you might say a little word about in a sort of tactical application. The other happened out in San Jose recently. Talk about these 2 other aspects of this and how they could also create problems that need to be protected.
You can physically attack the grid. Now, there's a cyber issue. You can cyber attack the grid as well. You can physically attack it, and you can physically attack it. In San Jose this past spring, people that knew what they were doing, they disabled 911 system. They went into an underground a facility that had transformers. They had to move a 250-pound manhole cover to get in there, and they shot up transformers with assault rifles and damaged the transformers. Now this was they planned it out. They got away. There's even more sophisticated things you could do, and I won't go into them for security reasons, but there's any knowledgeable person, there's a lot of techniques that you can use to cause real damage at critical junctures of the grid. And likewise, there is devices that you can make that are powerful microwave emitters, and they deliver a burst of energy very similar to the E1 microwave component of a high-altitude nuclear electromagnetic pulse bomb. And only these devices, they don't cost a lot of money to make. I mean, I know people that have, in spare parts, have made crude ones for a couple $100 of spare parts. You can buy them off the shelf for a few $1,000s. And what they do is, think of the most massive static electric shock you can imagine. That literally, if you were in the vicinity of it, you might arc, feet of static shock, not the little inch one that comes off your charged sweater. And when that happens, it fries microcircuits. And people that have a malicious intent, they can go outside stock exchanges, bank clearinghouses, control houses of electric power companies. And if you have unshielded electronics, that if you did the protection that we're asking for, it would really mitigate any of these tactics of use. Yet that they exist, and it's only a matter of when, not if, adversaries of the United States employ them. I just want to raise one other point, too. Last Tuesday, there was a conference in Washington, D.C., where General Michael Hayden, former director of CIA and the former DNI, spoke, and he says, it's kind of an appalling statement, but he said, we looked at this and we thought that this is a really serious problem, but it's really hard to figure out what to do about it, so we kind of kicked it down the road. Now, two things there. One is, that's why we pay political and national security elites to address these problems. And it's disheartening to kick it down the road. But at the end of the day, there are continuity government programs that protect the political and national security elites, but not the 300 million other Americans. So it's basically, I personally think it's immoral to not have at least told the American public that they even give them the dignity to tell them that there really is such threats and hazards as we're discussing here today, and we're not doing a thing about it, and by the way, you're on your own if something goes bad. And that's immoral.
Let me close just by a final question to Beverly. You have been doing some filming, as you
Yes.
mentioned earlier, of people, regular folks,
Right.
who have suffered the consequences, not from some of these exotic space storms, but
Right.
regular storms, hurricanes
Right.
and the like. You've chronicled some pretty compelling stories.
Absolutely.
Just wrap this up with, if you would, an insight into how you think the average American would likely respond
Right.
to the possibility that not only might the power go out, as we have experienced, all of us, for brief periods of time, but for years on end.
Well, the thing that I have really seen first off is that there are so many issues to know, and the American public doesn't really have the time or the understanding or the desire to follow everything. It is imperative that we put this information out and that people know, because this affects everything in your life. Everything. There is not anything that we do in our lives that is not affected by electricity, whether it's going to your ATM machine, whether it's picking up your phone, whether it is doing anything that we are used to doing. People's lives have been turned upside down in ways that I never even imagined, and people died. The tragedies, the horrific stories that I heard just going out and filming the hurricane victims, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy. But now you start talking about all the other possibilities of what can bring this about, and our lives would be completely turned upside down. Many people would die. They wouldn't have access to their medications. They wouldn't have the ability to go to, as I said, an ATM machine and get money to be able to take care of whatever it is that we're used to doing. Nuclear reactors, and you gentlemen know a lot more about this, but they're cooled by electrical systems. So what happens if that goes down? It affects us in every single way we know. If you're in an elevator and you can't get out of an elevator because there's no electricity, what do you do? And the stories that I have been hearing and what causes it are heart-wrenching, they're terrifying, and they are absolutely, they're just all-encompassing. And we must do something about this. And it seems like, as you said, it's so crazy not to do something when we can do it now, because later on, when this happens, and it's going to happen from something, we will not be able to deal with it. There will be no way to take care of it, whereas now it is possible, it's doable, and it needs to be done.
Amen. A great note on which to conclude.